This story took place on a pre-holiday spring day. I was let off work early, and since it was payday, my spirits were high. My friend Jacob decided to do something special for his wife. He went to the flower store and bought the most beautiful bouquet he could find. Flowers aren't cheap these days, but Jacob wanted to pamper his wife. "It's not every day I buy her flowers," Jacob thought as he walked home. The elevator took him to his floor, and he opened the door to his apartment. As soon as he stepped inside, another door opened behind him, the door of his neighbor across the hall, Nathan. Nathan was a helpful guy. On several occasions he had helped Jacob carry heavy things into the apartment. Although Nathan struggled to find steady work, Jacob used his connections to get him a job with his company. Jacob even vouched for him. But in the last few days, Nathan began to get sick a lot. Jacob began to wonder if his neighbor had recovered. Smiling, Jacob turned around to check on Nathan. Instead of Nathan, Jacob's wife, Abigail, came out of the neighbor's apartment. She looked disheveled, her hair was a mess, and she was wearing only a loosely tied robe. The awkward silence that followed was palpable. Both Jacob and Abigail froze, caught off guard. Abigail's face flushed as she avoided her husband's piercing gaze. Jacob shifted his gaze from his wife to the neighbor's door. He rang the doorbell. When Nathan finally opened it, he was just as unkempt and wearing only boxers. The smell of sweat and stale air wafted from the apartment. Jacob did not hesitate to punch Nathan in the jaw. Nathan jerked back, hit his head on the doorframe, and collapsed on the floor, clutching his head. A vase fell from a nearby shelf, shattering loudly, as if to echo the tension. Jacob turned to Abigail, who stood with her mouth open. "Shut your mouth. It stinks unbearably," he muttered and headed for his apartment. Abigail hesitated, not knowing whether to check on Nathan or follow her husband. Finally, she tiptoed back to their apartment, as if she were sneaking into someone else's house, and her heart raced. Jacob was sitting at the kitchen table, smoking a cigarette. He barely glanced at her and said, "Go take a shower. Wash the smell of your neighbor off of you, and then we'll talk." His voice was calm, but with a touch of venom. Abigail hurried into the bathroom and spent far more time under the jets of water than necessary. She scrubbed her skin until it was reddened, as if she could cleanse herself of her shame. Abigail was an attractive woman, tall, with a slender figure, smooth legs, shoulder-length blonde hair, and large, slightly slanted light blue eyes. At work, she often drew attention to herself, receiving not-so-subtle advances from male coworkers, especially during office parties. Abigail always managed to deflect these advances without offending anyone and keeping her reputation intact. She didn't love Jacob deeply, but she appreciated the stability he provided and the respectability of their life together. She wasn't going to let it all fall apart because of a momentary lapse in judgment. Her thoughts raced as the water poured over her. Drying herself off and leaving the bathroom, Abigail rehearsed what she would say to calm Jacob down. She was sure she could smooth things over. Jacob, after all, had always been loyal to her. She had seen him sacrifice his needs countless times to make her happy. Surely she could find a way to approach him. Jacob gestured for her to sit at the table. His gaze was cold and unwavering. "I got this apartment from my parents," he began. "I'm not going to share it with you. If you want to leave without shame, pack your things. We'll quietly file for divorce and go our separate ways. We don't have kids to complicate things." He paused. "I trusted you, Abigail, and you betrayed me with Nathan. Who would have thought it? I even got that loser a job. And now this." Abigail tried to interject, but Jacob silenced her with a glare. "Tell me, what was missing for you? Why wasn't I enough for you?" Tears came to Abigail's eyes. She began to cry. "I'm sorry, Jacob. I was stupid. I only love you." She reached for him, but Jacob grabbed her wrists tightly. "Don't touch me. You've lost that right." He let go of her hands. "You have an hour to gather your things. Take what belongs to you and go to your mother. I can't live under the same roof with someone like you." Stunned, Abigail gathered her things. The door slammed behind her as she left, and the sound sounded like the end of an era. With suitcase in hand, she stood in the hallway and stared at Nathan's door. Reluctantly, she rang the bell. It was a long time before Nathan answered. He looked worse than ever. Jacob had a large bruise on his face. His shirt was wrinkled, and he seemed hesitant to meet her gaze. "What do you want?" he asked curtly. Abigail rushed over to him and hugged him tightly. "What has he done to you? How could he hurt you so much? My love, I'm by your side now. I left him for you." Nathan stepped back, gently but firmly pushing her away. "Go home, Abigail. This isn't going to work out." He gestured to her suitcase. "Get your things and go." With those words, he closed the door in her face. Abigail sank down onto her suitcase on the landing and sobbed quietly so the neighbors wouldn't hear, but the tears wouldn't stop. In one day, Abigail had lost everything: a loving husband, a young lover, and the comfortable life she took for granted. It was all gone in an instant. Hours passed, and Abigail stayed on the landing, replaying the events over and over in her head. The once bright future she'd envisioned had crumbled. The sound of distant footsteps brought her back to reality, but there was nowhere to go. She wiped away her tears, stood up and dragged her suitcase to the elevator, her heart heavy with regret and the weight of her own choices.